Good morning. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn me down just a little, to John chapter 2. This morning, as David said, we're kicking off a new series called Signs. And during the average day, we encounter all kinds of different signs. So there are warning signs. This time of year, there are election signs. There are billboard signs. You go inside of a building, you see directional signs. If you drive around a lot, you'll see cars that have been turned into moving signs. There are a lot of different signs, but one thing that every sign has in common is that a sign always points to something else. The sign is never the main thing. It's always what it points to that's the main thing. So one expert said it this way: the purpose of a sign is to identify, to advertise, and to give direction. The dictionary defines a sign as an object whose presence or occurrence indicates the probable presence or occurrence of something else. So the sign, in and of itself, no matter how attention-grabbing it is never the main thing. It always points you to something else, and in most cases, it points you to something better. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. I've got a picture I want to show you that you may recognize. Now, this is an iconic sign, the Hollywood sign. First erected in 1923. It sits on a bluff overlooking the city. But as iconic as that sign has become, you know that sign is not the main attraction. It just tells you that you're getting closer to the main attraction. It points you to something else. Here's another one I want to show you. How many of you have seen this one in person? This sits on the south end. When the invitation is given today, I'll expect all of you up here to be no, I'm just kidding. This sits on the south end of the Las Vegas Strip, lets you know that you're getting closer to the thing that you came there for. It's not the sign itself, it's what it represents. Here's another one that you may recognize. How many of you have seen this like on vacation, right? How many of you took that as a clear sign from God that you're supposed to stop? The hot now sign is one of the clearest indications that God loves us and wants what's best for us. So anytime you see that, you're doing the spiritual thing if you stop. Now, there's one more, and if you're a local person, you may recognize this one. There's a lot of things in our community that we don't have, but one of the things we do have is one of the best places in the world to get a burger. So if you get hungry at lunchtime this next week, I'll go with you. Just call me and I'll be glad to go with you. All these signs are recognizable. All of them are cool, but they're not the primary thing. When you think of the pool hall, you don't look at the sign and say, boy, I can't wait to go down there and look at that sign. You think, I can't wait to go down there and get a burger, because a sign always directs you to something better. It indicates the presence of something else. Now, here's why that's important. Throughout the Gospel of John, the writer of John, a guy named John, who was an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, but was also Jesus' best friend, meaning he had a front row seat to a lot of things that other people missed, tells 7 different stories of miracles that Jesus performed. Now, if you know anything about Jesus, if you've read the New Testament, you know that's not unusual, because Jesus performed lots of miracles. But John puts the focus on 7 of them in particular, and rather than calling them miracles, he calls them signs. And he does that because a sign always points you to something better. Now, from John's perspective, the miracles themselves, as great as they were and as cool as they were never the point of the story. Now, I know in our culture, a lot of people obsess over the miraculous, but that is not what John did. To John, the miracles that Jesus performed were simply signs that pointed us to something better. So you get to the end of John's gospel, John chapter 20, he says it like this. He said, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So to John, the purpose of the miracles or the signs were not the signs themselves, as cool as they were. Instead, the purpose was to point us to the person of Jesus. Now, most scholars agree the Gospel of John was written somewhere between 85 and 90 AD, which means it was written much later than the other three Gospels, and about 50 years after the events which it describes had taken place. So here's what this means. When John sat down to write his account of Jesus' life, he was writing to people that were a lot like us and that they had never physically seen Jesus. They'd heard all the stories about Jesus, but most of the people that had seen Jesus had already died. John's now a really old man. So he sits down to write his account, and here's the question he's answering. He's saying, here's what you need to know about Jesus so that you can believe in Jesus. So our hope is, as we go through these next few weeks, is that every week you'll learn something about Jesus that helps you believe in Jesus. So to get us started, we're going to look at what happened when Jesus and a small group of his disciples went to a wedding in a place called Cana. Now, this is one of those rare stories that even the people who don't go to church, never really grew up in church, even they know this story, and yet most of us have no idea what it's really about. It's like we know something happened, but we're not sure why it happened or what any of it means. So what we're going to do this morning, just walk through this story, and we'll tell you what happened, but more importantly, we're going to focus on why it happened. Now, so to set the stage, all of this happens right at the beginning of the 3 years that we call Jesus' public ministry, and it comes right on the heels of him calling his first disciples. That's what you see at the end of John chapter 1. Then as John chapter 2 opens, Jesus and this small group of his disciples go to a wedding to which they've been invited. So here's what it says, John chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Now, sometimes you read the Bible, there are questions that the Bible doesn't answer that you may be asking. For example, whose wedding was this? Why were Jesus and his disciples invited there? How many people were there? I mean, was this a family member? Was this a friend? As you keep reading, you're going to read about Jesus' mother, and you're going to think, well, why was she there, and why is she playing such a leading role in somebody else's wedding? So there's a lot of things we don't know, but even though there's some things we don't know, here's what we do know. In the first century culture, a wedding was a huge deal. Now, I know in recent years, there's been sort of, especially post-COVID, there's been sort of this trend of smaller, more intimate weddings. But in those days, weddings were seen as community events. And almost inevitably, the way it worked is every marriage was an arranged marriage. Here's what this means. Rather than like a couple, meeting and falling in love, their parents would work out some kind of a business deal, and they would sign a contract, some money would exchange hands. And then there would be this formal ceremony where the man and the wife, the man and the woman, would pledge themselves to each other just like we do today. But now this is where it gets really weird, so I want you to hang with me. After the little ceremony took place, so the contract's been signed, the money's exchanged hands, the deal's done, everybody stands up and says, I do. Rather than going home with their new husband, the wife would then return home with her parents. It was called the betrothal period. Sometimes it lasted 2 months. Sometimes it was up to a year. And during that time, they were still considered legally married. They just didn't live together. Now, in our culture, a lot of people live together before they get married. In that culture, they did not live together even after they got married. And so here's what would happen. The new husband would go back to his place, go back to his house, and he would redo his house, and he would prepare his house for the eventual arrival of his bride. So that would take 2 months, maybe a year. It depends on what he was doing. And then when that was over, the new husband would get a bunch of his friends together. And I know this sounds strange, but just hang with me. And they would light these torches. And they would walk through town just as the sun was going down. They would go to the place where the bride was staying, which was usually with her parents. And that was her signal that it was now time to leave her parents' house and go to her new house with her new husband. But it was also the signal to everybody in town that the party was getting ready to start. Historically, the party started on Wednesday night. You would think of it, they would call it a wedding feast. We would call it kind of an extended wedding reception on Wednesday night. And it would last until the next Wednesday night. Now, in our culture, you go to a wedding, you go to the reception, about 45 minutes, you're out, right? Unless it's like a family member, then you might stay for an hour and 15, but after that, you're making a beeline towards the exit. In that culture, it lasted a week. Now, that's the backstory. Now, look at what happens in verse 3. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Now, over the years, I've participated in a lot of weddings. In fact, I had one yesterday. And every wedding that I've ever been a part of, it never fails that something goes wrong. Sometimes it's something big. Most of the time it's something small that nobody notices, but it always happens. One of the wedding party gets sick, can't make it. Somebody stumbles over a word. One of the groomsmen forgets his socks or wears the wrong vest or buttons his coat wrong. Somebody, the unity candle blows out. The music doesn't start when it's supposed to. I mean, most of the time it's nothing major. And if you're not really paying attention, you might not even notice. But this problem that they're encountering is the kind of scenario that would have created some long-term problems, not just for the couple, but for their entire family. If you're married, imagine what it would be like to invite everybody to your wedding reception and run out of food. Now, multiply that times 1,000,000, and you're still not close to what these people would have been feeling or how embarrassing this would have been, because in their culture, wine was a measure of a person's wealth. So if you ran out of wine, it was the same thing as admitting that you were now bankrupt. I even read where one historian said if you went to a wedding as an invited guest and they ran out of wine while you were there, you had a right to file a lawsuit against the host that had invited you. That's how serious this was. But even if nobody filed a lawsuit, this is the kind of mistake that everybody would be talking about. This is the kind of thing that would bring a lot of shame to these two families and potentially haunt this young couple for the rest of their lives. That's why when you get to verse 3, Jesus' mother comes to him and she informs him of the situation and she says, "They have no more wine." Now again, we don't know why she was there. We're not sure, what's going on in the backstory, but we do know that she realizes the seriousness of the situation, so she immediately goes to Jesus. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that she doesn't actually ask him to do anything. She simply makes an observation. But don't let that fool you, because some of you had moms, that were experts at getting their point across without actually saying it. I was thinking about my grandma this week. When I first moved out, I'd go home on Saturday, and my grandpa and I would be we would watch a football game or whatever, and I'd come in, I'd give my grandma a hug. I'd say, "Mama, how you doing?" She'd say, "I'm good, but the grass is getting high." Or the bushes are getting tall. Now, if you look at a transcript, she didn't actually ask me to do anything, but the point was pretty clear. Same thing with Mary and Jesus. So you get to verse 4, and Jesus steps into action. "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." Now, if you're not careful, you can read this kind of Jesus as being insulting. He's talking down his mouth. That's not it. The English kind of obscures this. A better translation would be, "Yes, ma'am, but what does that have to do with me?" Now, one of the things you'll see throughout John's gospel as we continue through this is Jesus is always talking about what he calls his hour, talking about the hour of his glorification, his death, burial, and resurrection. So right from the beginning of his life, Jesus knows that his life is building toward this particular moment, and everything in his life is heading toward that moment. But then you get to verse 5, and he realizes he's got to do something, because when mama asks you to solve a problem, or when your grandma asks you to mow the grass, that's what you do. Verse 5. His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars," so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw out some and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside, and he said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, but then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now." Now again, this is a pretty famous story. Everybody knows the story, but it's a story that most of us misread. Most of us read this and we say, okay, Jesus is helping out somebody that's in trouble. And that's true, but it goes deeper than that. This is really a story about transformation. It starts when Jesus transforms the water into wine, but as cool as that is, that's not even the main part of the story. There are at least three other significant transformations that you see happen here in John chapter 2. So if you're keeping track, here's the first one. Jesus transforms a problem into a party. Now at the end of verse 3, Jesus' mother comes to him. She says, hey, they've got a problem. There's no more wine. And I know that can be a touchy subject, especially in our community when you come off the heels of a wet, dry vote. And it is true that the wine they drink in Scripture was not as potent, not as strong as the wine you find in most places today. But it's also true that because their drinking water was so contaminated, they drank wine with almost every meal. So if that's all you have to drink, and the feast is still going on, and there's no wine left to drink, inevitably that means that the party is about to be over. And if Jesus had not been there, the party would have been over. But because Jesus was there, rather than coming to a close, the party continues. And not only does it continue, it goes to an entirely new level. So you go back to verse 2, John tells us clearly that Jesus and his disciples didn't crash this wedding. They were invited. Now keep in mind, at this point in his life, Jesus was not invited because he was a celebrity, because at this point, he was not a celebrity. Hardly anybody knew who he was. He was still kind of this eccentric rabbi, kind of roaming the countryside. So most likely this is a family member, this is a friend, but he's invited to the wedding because people like to be around Jesus. Now I know in our culture, a lot of people, whenever they think about Jesus, they always think of him as angry and mad, and he's frowning, and he's looking for somebody to judge. And if we're not really careful, that can become what people think about when they think about us. Just one time, I wish there was a way, maybe there is, I don't know, but I wish there was a way for you all to see what I see when I'm standing up here. I mean, David knows what I'm talking about. It's not everybody, thankfully it's not everybody, it's not even most people. But there are some things that I see from here that you may not notice. People come to church, and some people, the moment they sit down, they immediately start to look bored, right? So I look out, and they're kind of, some people do this. And some people are like this. And thankfully it's not everybody, but I don't think, that's not the picture you get of Jesus when you read the New Testament. The picture a lot of people have, but that's not the picture. Instead, the picture you get is that Jesus was the kind of person who people liked to be around. He smiled easily. He laughed a lot. He naturally drew people in. And thankfully, Jesus was the kind of person that could turn any problem into a party. Now, here's the second one. Jesus can take the old and turn it into something new. Go back to verse 6. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. So John mentions these jars are here, these pots, whatever they want to call them, and they're huge. I mean, 20, 30 gallons, and they're used by the Jews for the ceremonial washing. The Jewish people had all kinds of rules they had to follow, and whenever they would show up at a place, in order to ritually kind of cleanse themselves, they had to wash their hands. And depending on what kind of Jew they were, they had to wash all the way up to their elbows as a symbol that they were now ceremonially clean. So in that sense, these pots that are there filled with this water represent what we would call the Old Covenant. So you go back through the Old Testament, it's this idea that's woven throughout the Old Testament that if you want to be accepted by God, you've got to follow all the rules, you've got to follow all the right rituals, and you've got to offer all the right sacrifices. And if you somehow mess up one of the rules or you break one of the rules, then you've got to make sure you go through all these hoops so that you can be accepted by God in the future. And if you know your Old Testament history, then you know that was nothing more than a recipe for frustration. Because no matter how many times they washed their hands, no matter how many times they offered the right sacrifices, they could not live up to this impossible standard. They could not save themselves. They could not wash away the stain of sin. And so as these jars or these huge pots are setting outside this wedding party, it represents that whole deal, that whole entire system. The great Bible scholar F.F. Bruce said it like this. He said, the water provided for purification as laid down by the Jewish law and custom stands for the whole ancient order of Jewish ceremony, which Christ was to replace with something better. So when Jesus comes along and he takes the water that's supposed to be used to wash your hands and wash away your sins, and he turns that into wine, he's doing more than just solving a problem for a friend. He's foreshadowing what he came to do by fulfilling the law that we could never fulfill ourselves, then dying in our place so that we could experience something that was better. And what you find in John chapter 2 is the first hint, not of a cool story about how Jesus did something incredible, although he does. It's really a picture that John's going to develop throughout the rest of his gospel of the old covenant giving way to the new covenant. And so now, because of what Jesus did on the cross, rather than spending our lives trying to save ourselves, we can put our trust in him and allow him to do for us what we can never do for ourselves. And that leads right to the third thing you see in this passage, and that's that Jesus transforms unbelievers into believers. Check out the way John says this in verse 11. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now that word that gets translated as first is the same word from which we get our English word archetype. So this is not necessarily the first miracle that Jesus did. It's just the archetype that all the other miracles will follow. So you'll see as we go through this and we look at the next 6 in John, they all follow the same pattern. In each instance, the result will be similar in that there will be people who will start to believe in Jesus because of what they've seen him do. That's what John highlights in verse 11. He says, his disciples saw this and they believed in him. And you think about what this moment must have been like for them. I mean, just a few days before, they're out there just living their life, and then out of nowhere, they're invited to become disciples of this little-known rabbi, and now they've had a front row seat for this unbelievable miracle. It's hard to imagine what they must have been thinking, but in that moment when they saw him do what only he could do, they started to believe just a little bit more. And keep in mind, the way John tells the story, most of the people at the party had no idea a miracle had taken place. And that's why they take that to the host, the master of the banquet, and he tries the wine. He says, this is much better than the stuff you brought out. And you know how this works. They would bring out the good stuff first. Then after everybody had been drinking all day and their appetites were a little bit, whatever, they bring out the cheaper stuff. But then they bring out this wine, and the master of the banquet says, this is better than what you brought out first. And nobody can explain it, but it's better than expected. And it happened all because of Jesus. Now here's my question. How does that happen? How do you experience that kind of transformation? Here's what I know is true about you, because it's true of all of us. Right now, as you think about your life, there's some problem that you're facing. There's something that's missing. There's something that's gone off the rails. Maybe when you were growing up, you were convinced that your life was going to be, filled with love and laughter and joy. But instead, it's been frustration and anger and anxiety. And maybe you've already done everything you know to do to change it and make it better. And in the process of that, you're starting to realize there's nothing you can do. There's some problems that you can't solve. And you might never admit this, but there's a part of you that wonders if Jesus is even capable of change. So if I asked you, do you believe? You'd say, yeah, I believe, but there's a part of you that's an unbeliever. Like, I believe he exists, but I'm not sure he can do anything about my situation. I mean, what do you do when you're there? What do you do when you're in desperate need of some sort of change, some sort of transformation, and you're not sure how to experience it? There's two things. Here's the first one. First, you have to invite him in. Invite him in. What would have happened if Jesus had not been invited to this wedding? Like, don't overthink this. It's not a trick question. First, they would have run out of wine. The party would have ended abruptly. Everybody would have gone home mad. The families would have been humiliated. And this young couple would have started their life together in shame. And that's what would have happened if Jesus had not been there. The only thing that saved them from having to experience that is that when they sat down to put their guest list together for their wedding, they made sure that Jesus was on it. And here's the thing about Jesus. Whenever he's invited to something, he always comes. He's not like some of us. I mean, you get an invitation, somebody texts you and say, hey, I want you to come to this. And you say, hey, I'd love to come to your thing, but I've already got this other thing. And, next time you have a thing, invite me and I'll come. Jesus never does that. Instead, every time he's invited, he shows up. And here's the second thing. First, you have to invite him in. And then you have to do what he says. When you go back to verse 5, you'll see what I think are the only words in the Gospel of John attributed to Mary, the mother of Jesus, where she looks at these servants and she says, do whatever he tells you. And then in the next couple of verses, Jesus tells them to do something. Don't miss this. Jesus tells them to do something that on the surface of it makes zero sense. I mean, why would you worry about filling up water jugs when the problem is that you're out of wine? Maybe like if you came up to me after the service and you said, hey, my car won't start because I'm out of gas, and I say, hey, here's a bottle of water. That's not going to help you. Water is not gas, and it's not wine either. But you need to understand, that's usually how it works. You think your problem is one thing. And you've identified it, you've analyzed it, you've thought about it from every angle, but then you invite Jesus into the situation and he tells you to do something that on the surface of it seems completely disconnected from your problem. But what you don't understand, it's that when you do what Jesus tells you to do, it unleashes his power in your life. Another way to think about it is that your obedience is the key that unlocks the door to transformation. But here's what we do. Jesus tells us to do something, and we don't see how it connects to our problem, and so we choose not to do it, and then we wonder why nothing ever changes. Now here's the deal. If I don't miss my guess, at least for a few of us here this morning, it kind of feels like we've run out of wine. You know what I mean by that? Maybe it's not all bad, but some of it's bad. I mean, it can happen in 1,000 different ways, but the result is always the same. You thought it was going to be one way, it turned out to be a different way. You expected your life to be kind of like this big wedding party, and everybody's going to be laughing and happy, and there's plenty to eat and plenty to drink, and then you find out that the party has come to an abrupt end. And you're left wondering, can it ever get any better? And the answer is yes. But you can't make it better. Not until you invite Jesus to become a part of whatever it is that's messing with you, and then you do what he tells you to do, even when it doesn't seem like what he's telling you to do has anything to do with what you think is your biggest problem. See, here's the thing I love about this story. Nobody at the party could explain how Jesus did what he did. Nobody. I mean, if you were somehow able to go back in time and interview the people who had been at that party and who tasted that new wine and said, how did Jesus do that? Nobody could have answered your question. They had no idea how he did it. But just because they didn't know how to explain it didn't mean that they couldn't experience it. See, some of you are sitting here right now in the back of your mind, you're thinking, okay, I got this thing, and I got this other thing, and I got these two big things, and I don't have any idea how God could do anything to solve these problems. And here's the deal. It doesn't matter if you know how. It's not your job to know how Jesus does what he does. Your job is to simply do what he tells you to do and then experience whatever he does that only he can do. I want you to stand with me. As we close today, we're going to sing a couple of final songs together. And as we do, there are two questions I want you to ask yourself. First, I want you to ask yourself, have I invited him in? It's possible that the answer to that is no. I mean, I come to church every week, and I go to Sunday school, and I read my Bible, and et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't mean you invited him in. I mean, you can go to school. That don't mean you've learned anything. So you have to ask you, have I really invited him in? Have I really asked him to become a part of my life? Have I accepted him as my Savior? And if you have, then there's a second question. If you haven't, that's the first issue. But if you have, the second question is, am I doing what he told me to do? Am I doing what he told me to do? And the answer might be no. You say, I don't understand I feel like he's telling me to do this, but I don't see how it connects. Doesn't matter. Not your job to see how it connects. Your job is to simply do what he tells you to do. And if you're not, it's not going to get any better. But if you do, you might just find that he'll do something that you can't explain. So if you need to pray with somebody, need to talk to somebody, Dave and I will be here. We'd be glad to talk with you, be glad to pray with you, be glad to do whatever you want us to do.